All right, welcome back to our study of 2 John here on the Listener's Commentary. In this recording, we will be looking at the entire letter. It is a short letter, and so it consists of 13 verses, and we will walk down through those 13 verses here on this recording and explore some of the things that 1 John has to say to the original audience as well as to us. And so the letter of 2 John opens this way: the elder. That's where it begins. It begins with customary introduction and greetings, following the format of Greco-Roman letters, where you have the sender, then the recipient, and then some sort of greeting, and then usually after that, some sort of well wish. That was sort of the flow, the way letters were expected to be written in the first century, and John follows that pattern. And so he begins with himself as the sender, whom he describes as the elder. It would have been nice for us later readers if the author had been a little bit more clear about who he was, the elder John or something like that. But the best and earliest testimonies we talked about in the backstory is that this is John, the son of Zebedee. And the title elder indicates that he's an older man with the weight of spiritual authority to write to them. And because he can simply identify himself as the elder, it indicates that they know him. They know who he is. He needs no introduction. And so he's the elder. He's an older, mature leader. And that title, elder, had been used for church leaders since the early days of the church. So the elder, and then he gives the recipient to the chosen lady and her children. And as we noted in the backstory, obviously that could refer to a literal lady and her kids, but most likely it refers to a church. And we explained the reasons for that in the backstory, but that's who we're talking about. The chosen lady and her children is a church. And chosen refers to the identity of the church as God's chosen people. They are chosen. They are elect. They belong to God as his people for his purposes in the world. To the chosen lady, and the reason it's a lady, as we explained in the backstory, is that the Greek word for church is a feminine noun in Greek, and therefore it was customary to refer to the church as a she, a lady. So, to the chosen lady and her children, to a church, whom, John says, I love in truth, which could simply mean whom I love genuinely, truthfully, sincerely, could mean that. But in view of everything that says in the rest of the sentence and in verse 2, it probably means more than that. Whom I love in the truth, meaning in the fact that we're in the truth together. I love you, not just genuinely, I love you in the truth about Jesus, in the truth that we have learned through Jesus. So whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. In other words, I love this chosen lady, i.e. this church, but not only me, everyone who loves the truth also loves this church, loves these people who make up this church. So whom I love in the truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. And then verse 2 says, because of the truth, which remains in us and will be with us forever. And I'm taking the us there in that first half of verse 2, probably refer to John, all those who know the truth that he just mentioned, and the chosen lady and her children, all of us together, because of the truth which remains in all of us together. And notice what he says, that truth remains in us. It's literally an adverb, not a verb. The way they've translated it as a verb, it's the truth which remains in us, but it's better like the abiding truth, the remaining truth, the truth, the indwelling truth. That's the idea of this, the way it reads is, so the truth is described as abiding in us truth. That's the kind of truth it is. And it's the kind of truth, he says, that will be in us and with us forever and ever. We're going to enjoy this truth. We're going to experience this truth. It's going to dwell in us, not just for now, but forever. And it's important for us to notice in the first couple verses here, the emphasis on truth. This is central to what John wants to communicate to the chosen lady and her children. that there is truth about God and there is truth about Jesus, and it can be known, and we must love it and know it so that it remains in us and with us forever. So that's the sender, the elder, and the recipient, the chosen lady and her children who are in the truth. And now the greetings, verse 3, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. A couple interesting things to note about the way this greeting is expressed by John here. Notice, unlike what Paul typically says in the greetings in his letters, grace, mercy, and peace to you, that's the way Paul usually says it, John writes, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us. So it's not like a wish for grace, mercy, and peace, but it's like we have that and it will be with us. We enjoy that as God's people. Grace refers to God's active kindness, his favorable disposition towards us. Grace, God's giving of himself graciously to us. Mercy and peace, which was the standard Jewish way to greet one another. Shalom, as you would greet one another. Peace. And so grace, mercy, peace will be with us. And then the other interesting thing to notice here is he says, from God the Father, that's understandable, and from Jesus Christ, that's pretty understandable. We get that. That's similar to what Paul says. But notice how he describes Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father in truth and love. And I think that's motivated by the situation swirling around the churches that John is writing to in 1 John and here in 2 John, where there's this issue about Jesus being the Messiah and thus the Son of God, where they have questions about the incarnation, where people are questioning that idea. And we'll actually see that show up a little later in this letter itself. So that's the greetings from the elder to the chosen lady. Now we enter into the body of the letter, which will develop the topics of truth and love in a way that's pertinent to the original readers. So John writes in verse 4, I was overjoyed to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we have received a commandment to do so from the Father. Notice a couple things here in verse 4. He says, walking in the truth. That describes living according to the truth. Walking was the way you went anywhere in John's day. If you're going to, in the city of Ephesus where John's living, if you're going to go to the bathhouse or the gymnasium or the marketplace, anywhere you want to go, you're going to walk there. So walking becomes this picture of going about your life. So walking in the truth describes living, going about your life according to the truth. Truth, therefore, is not merely something you know. Truth is a path to be walked. It's a way of life. I think Jesus is getting at that same idea when he describes himself as the way, the truth, and the life. There's a way. There's a way that's in keeping with the truth. There's a way that brings life. So truth is something you walk in. And that's a very Hebrew way of thinking and talking. In fact, I think it's much more in sync with real life. Like truth is something to do. Do the truth. Don't just know it, do it. Do the truth. And John says here in verse 4 that he knows that at least some of the members of this church he's writing to are doing just that. They're walking in the truth. Now, when he says some of your children are walking in the truth, that doesn't necessarily mean that others in the church are not doing that. It could be the case. But all John means to say by that is that he's found out that some of them are. Maybe because they've come to Ephesus for business or for something else and he's been able to visit with them. Maybe by virtue of word of mouth from somebody who had been there and has come back to him. We don't know exactly how, but John's point is simply to say that he's learned that some of their children are walking in the truth, and that fact brings him great joy. He rejoices in that. Then John goes on to remind them of one key central command. Look at verse 5. He says, now, I ask you, lady, remember, chosen lady, probably referring to the church that he's writing to. Now I ask you, lady, not as though I were writing to you a new commandment, but the one which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. So this isn't a new commandment. This is something they've had from the beginning, and that phrase from the beginning is an important phrase to John in his letters. It shows up regularly in 1 John, and it refers to what was taught both by Jesus and by his apostles since the very beginning of the faith in Jesus. since the time that the church first came into existence. Here's what's been taught. And Jesus taught us the priority of love. And his apostles followed suit, teaching the priority of love. This is one of Jesus' central commands. Love one another, right? The two greatest commandments, Jesus said, are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. We love one another. Jesus himself said, as recorded in John's gospel, by this all people will know that we're his disciples, if we have love for one another. So this is what's been taught since the beginning. It's not a new commandment. It's one we've had from the beginning, that we should love one another. Then John goes on to help us think through, how do we know that we're loving one another well? Well, look at verse 6. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you heard from the beginning, that you are to walk in it. And so walking according to his commandments is what we're supposed to do if we want to love God and love others well. This is the same thing John taught us in 1 John. Genuine love for God and genuine love for others is made clear and explicit in the commandments that we have from God and the commandments that Jesus taught us. Those commands, those instructions show us what genuine, godly, Christ-like love looks like. Because love is sort of a squishy word, and if it doesn't have some content, we could easily deceive ourselves into thinking we're loving when we're not actually doing what Jesus would do if he were in our place. And so obeying his commandments, walking in his commandments, become sort of the pattern for what it looks like to love God and love others well. Then John explains why this is so important that he's writing to them about this. So look at verse 7. He says, he's giving a reason, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the antichrist. This captures very much the same scenario lying behind 1 John that we talked about in the backstory to 1 John and all throughout our study of that letter. We mentioned it here in the backstory to 2 John. But here's one of the passages in 1 John where John says something similar to what we have here. 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, John writes this, "Children, it is the last hour, and just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, well, even now many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it's the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not really of us, for if they had been of us, they would have remained with us. But they went out so that it would be evident that they're not at all of us." And what John is getting at there in 1 John, as we explained then, is these are people who are opposed to Jesus being the Messiah. And that's the same situation we have here. They've gone out from the church into the world, and they don't acknowledge, as John says here in verse 7, they don't acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. And we're not sure exactly the details of in what way they configured that, but in some way they are denying that the human person Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah. In fact, literally the way it reads here is that Jesus Christ who had come in the flesh. They deny that. They don't acknowledge that Jesus as Messiah had come in the flesh. In other words, they reject the whole idea of incarnation, of God becoming flesh in the person of Jesus. And John says such a one is the deceiver and the antichrist. In fact, John is the only writer in the New Testament to use the word antichrist. And in his writings, 1 John and 2 John, where it shows up, it quite literally refers to people who are anti-Christ. That is, they are anti-Messiah. They are against the idea that the Messiah came in the flesh as the person Jesus from Nazareth. That's what John is talking about here in verse 7. So John warns them, "Watch yourselves, that you do not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward." In other words, pay attention. Watch yourselves. Pay attention. Keep on the alert. Don't fall for these false ideas. Don't fall for their spin and their twisted meanings about who the Messiah is and who Jesus is. Don't fall for it. Pay attention. Watch yourselves. And that's important that you watch yourself because it'll enable you to continue walking in the truth. And if you don't do that, you're going to you're going to lose out on what John and his team of teachers have led you into by leading you into the truth, by leading you into who Jesus is. You'll lose out on your full reward. John goes on and says, anyone who goes too far and does not remain in the teaching of Christ does not have God. It doesn't matter what they claim. It doesn't matter how spiritual they appear to be or claim to be. If they go too far, if they go beyond the truth and they step out of bounds and they've left the realm of truth, they go too far and they don't remain, they don't abide in, they don't stay in the teaching of the Messiah, teaching of Christ. Now that could be what Christ taught. And certainly, I think for John, Jesus' own teaching is included in the teaching of Christ. But the way John words it here and the way John talks in both 1st and 2nd John, I think we maybe need to be a little more specific than that. Since John anchors so much of what he says in his own teaching, like the things he taught them from the beginning, the things they've learned from the beginning, since the days the apostles taught them, right? John anchors so much of what he said in his own teaching and the apostles' teaching. And since John refers to the teachings, notice in verse 9, the teachings of Christ, not the teachings of Jesus. He could say it either way, but I think in knowing the situation, the teachings of Christ, that probably connects with verse 7 about Jesus Christ coming in the flesh, the whole situation lying behind these letters. So, while it probably does include Jesus' own teaching to some degree, I think the focus is more likely on teaching about the Christ. That is, teaching about the Christ coming in the flesh and Jesus being him. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, come in the flesh. I think that's what John is primarily getting at because of the situation he's dealing with here. So he says, if anyone goes too far and doesn't remain in the teaching about the truth of the Messiah, he doesn't have God. No matter what he says, he doesn't have God. The one who remains in the teaching, that is the teaching about the Messiah, Jesus, the one who remains in that teaching has both the Father and the Son. And notice that he doesn't say will have, but has, like a present tense. You want to be united with God the Father? You want to be united with God the Son? Remain in the teaching about Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God in the flesh. If anyone comes to you, John says in verse 10, and doesn't bring this teaching, that is the teaching about the Messiah, don't receive him into your house. This is something new that 2 John adds to it, where John gives very specific instructions. If anyone comes to you, traveling teachers and speakers were common. Hotels were infrequent and they had a bad reputation. So people relied on the hospitality of others to welcome them into their homes when they were traveling various places. And that's the essence of Christian hospitality. We'll talk about that more in 3 John. But that's the setting here. You have people who are coming and visiting, and they're looking for a place to stay. And John says, if they come and they don't hold to this teaching, let this be a litmus test for you. If they don't hold to the teaching about Jesus as the Son of God and Messiah, don't receive him into your house. Don't show him hospitality. Again, that is a striking action in the ancient world that communicated huge amounts of social data to the people watching, right? Like if you receive him, that says you're on the same page with him. If you don't receive him, that says he's not in good standing with you. So don't welcome him into your house. Don't give him a greeting. For the one who gives him a greeting, not just says hi, but the one who welcomes them into their house in peace and goodwill. That's the idea of give a greeting. The one who does that participates in his evil deeds, becomes a sharer in. That's the idea of participating. You're a sharing in. You're a supporter of his false teaching and his false ministry. You're helping further it in your town because you're giving the impression to others and to the church itself that you're on board with what he teaches. So John says, don't do that. Don't do that. That's a very simple, tangible action to say, no, that is not the truth. No, that is not what we believe. No, that is false. Don't show them hospitality. Then John wraps up this little letter by saying, though I have many things to write to you, I don't want to do so with paper and ink. I don't want to do so with my papyrus and my pen. That's not how I want to communicate these things to you, but I hope to come to you and speak with you face to face so that your joy may be made complete. So John's sending this letter in lieu of the fact that he can't be there, but he's hoping, if possible, he can make the trip to wherever this letter is going sometime soon so that he can talk with them and so that they can share together and that the people he's writing to could be deeply encouraged and experience great joy. And then he signs off the letter with, "The children of your chosen sister greet you." Probably greetings again from the church that John himself is a part of in Ephesus itself. She's greeting this church as well. Now, as we wrap up our study here of 2 John, let me just offer a couple reflections that I think are really important. They're at the center of this letter. It's not really anything new, just as John said he didn't write a new commandment, but I think it's really important that we emphasize it. And the first is this: walking in the truth. John talks about that here. Walking in the truth. There is truth. It can be known, and it must be done. It must be a path that we walk. If we are going to be followers of Jesus, we need to know the truth about Jesus. We need to know who Jesus is, that there is orthodoxy. There is truth about Jesus. And we must study it, learn it, know it, and we must remain in it. And it must shape how we go about our lives. We walk in the truth. And the second one, again, the second major theme of this letter is walking in love. We walk in both truth and we walk in love. Love needs to be something that we practice. Love is something that we do. We demonstrate love in the tangible ways we welcome and receive and care for and support and show one another. And that love has content. John tells us here in this letter that look at Jesus' commands, look at God's commands. They give you content to help you understand what loving one another is actually going to look like. It's not just a feeling. It's not just some vague, fuzzy thing that you get to make up. There is specific, tangible actions that constitute walking in love. That's why Jesus himself says that the whole law hangs on these two commands, loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. The whole law hangs on it in the sense that all the commands of the law somehow fit into those two categories. The commands of the law are really ultimately descriptors of and indicators that people are walking in love. And the same is true with things like the Sermon on the Mount and other teachings of Jesus. They help us to understand what it looks like to love one another well. And so may we be people, in the spirit of 2 John, may we be people who abide in the truth and walk in the truth, while at the same time, we carry out love, we practice love, we walk in Christ-like, Jesus-centered love for the people around us in our everyday life. All right, thanks for tuning in to our study of 2 John here on the Listener's Commentary. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generous support of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So, thanks a ton, so much for your support. And if you have been encouraged, challenged, built up by the Listener's Commentary, could I just invite you to prayerfully consider, if you're able to, join the team of supporters. The easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, and you can either click the Give button, and that'll redirect you to my page through World Family Mission, registered nonprofit, where you can put in a dollar amount. You can click a little box that says Make This Monthly, and all those funds will come my way. Or you can sign up right there on the homepage at listenerscommentary.com for the Study Hub, and that's another way just to support this ministry as well. All monthly donors get access to some of the online courses and bonus materials that are inside the Study Hub, and I'll continue to populate that Study Hub with more and more resources in the months ahead. Thanks a ton for your support.